Hello and welcome everyone to our 17th podcast. I'm Linda and here is Mike.
Hi, Linda. Welcome, everyone. In this podcast series, we are exploring social threefolding by reading and discussing the original 1919 basic book by Rudolf Steiner, The Core Points of the Social Question. As humanity evolves toward freedom, we need a new social paradigm called social threefolding to replace our existing hierarchical society. We are currently reading Chapter 2, which describes the principles and theory of social threefolding. We can make a limited comparison between human physiology and the three areas of social life. The economic life, comparable to the nerve sense system, is everything that has to do with the production, circulation, and consumption of goods. The rights life, comparable to the rhythmic circulatory system, is everything to do with our purely human-to-human relations. And the cultural life, comparable to our metabolic limb system, is everything that has to do with individual abilities. For historical reasons, the economic life dominates the other two within our current unified society. The economic life exists between the boundary formed by the natural foundation on one side and the rights life on the other. The economic life and the rights life give rise to entirely different kinds of relations between people. Through the economic life, relations arise because one person serves the needs of another. This economic relation is entirely different from what arises through public law, which has to do with our mutual entitlements and obligations under the banner of equality. Because these relations are fundamentally different, it is a mistake to combine economy and rights into a single state structure. Combined together, each will necessarily corrupt the principle of the other. Instead, state and economy must become separate, just as our nervous system is separate from our circulatory system. Only once this separation leads to real change on an institutional level will we finally be able to resolve certain social problems that are considered unsolvable today. So we must imagine the right state as having independent legislative and executive organs, and the economic life as having its own independent associations and money system. The leadership of each area will meet as peers, much like how leaders of sovereign countries do today. Each area will cultivate its own principles and influence the other from the outside. In a healthy society, the economic life concerns itself only with goods. Labor and rights must be separated from the economic life, such that there is no longer any labor market or real estate market. It is a fallacy to believe that we can exchange money representing a claim on goods for rights as if these were goods, as if we can purchase human-to-human rights like we do goods. Labor cannot be separated from the human being who performs it. And so, when we purchase labor as if it were a good, we commodify the human being. Instead, we must separate labor from what that labor produces or achieves. We can certainly purchase the product or achievement of labor, but we cannot purchase the labor itself. Labor in itself is purely a rights relation between human beings, purely a matter of fairness among people. Labor must be governed by the rights life, governed by labor laws and labor contracts. By making this distinction, we avoid treating the human being as an economic good. We avoid the dehumanization that necessarily comes from connecting labor to the economy. And similarly for real estate, which is likewise not a good and is instead fundamentally a matter of human-to-human rights, we must clearly distinguish, first of all, between land and nature, which no human being produced, and all the infrastructure, improvements, buildings, and other fixtures that human beings did produce. From the perspective of human to human rights relations, no human being created the earth, nor any of the naturally occurring minerals, plants, or animals connected with the earth. And therefore, logically, no human being has any right to charge money to any other human being for the right to use this naturally occurring component. Improvements, modifications, and buildings, on the other hand, are created by human beings. And so those who created this human-made component do have every right to be compensated for what they have produced. In this regard, the infrastructure component of real estate is produced through the application and organization of labor. And so, at least initially, it is no different than any other economic good. Steiner says this specifically in the 14th lecture of his National Economics course and in other places in his collected works. So this infrastructure component remains an economic good until such a point in time that the development work is finished and the real estate transforms into a means of production, such as a farm or a commercial property. At that moment, the societal rights relation changes. The real estate ceases to be a good, and then, as a means of production, it must be removed from the economic life entirely. It must no longer be bought and sold on a real estate market. Instead, it becomes purely a matter of the rights life, of human relations, and the cultural life of human abilities. From that point onward, the use rights must pass over to a competent manager who can use the real estate productively to bring forth goods that satisfy human needs. So to take an example, let's say person A gains access to a piece of empty land on which they build a chicken coop. This chicken coop is to be considered part of the infrastructure component, which is distinct from the naturally occurring land that it sits on. During construction, the chicken coop building is just like any other economic good. It is produced through the application and organization of labor. It can be sold, let's say, to person B, just like any other good. That is to say, the chicken coop is a good, even though the land it sits on is not. However, once the construction of the chicken coop is finished and populated with chickens, it transitions from an economic good to a means of production, namely a means of producing eggs for people to consume. As a means of production of goods for consumers, the chicken coop now takes on an entirely different role within society. It is in society's interest that it be used wisely by someone who is competent in caring for chickens and bringing eggs to market. For this reason, there must be a way to pass the use rights of the chicken coop to a competent manager. If not person B, then to someone else. So without getting into all the operational details that we will discuss in chapter 3 of this book, let's just be clear for now that a distinction must be made between the life of rights, which concerns relations between each human being and every other, and the life of economics, which concerns only the products and achievements of labor, namely goods. The rights associated with goods and economic transactions are distinct from those rights associated with labor and with means of production, including real estate. All right? Now, there's one more thing I wanted to add, specifically about residential real estate. In his collected works, Steiner mainly discusses agricultural and commercial real estate, which are or are linked to means of economic production and the associated rights to use and transfer. But how should we think about residential real estate, about private dwellings and rights to occupy and so on, considered separate from the land it sits on? Is a private dwelling really a means of production, or is it actually a consumable good and therefore an economic entity? So this is a topic we might wish to come back and discuss later, perhaps after we have fully grasped the new ownership model for commercial real estate, first of all, which is a large part of this book, more or less the whole of chapter 3 when we get there. But let's just be clear for now. Social threefolding describes the next evolution of private ownership for our times. Steiner saw the central importance of the individual and their freedom to act according to their own initiative. So Steiner's ideas will definitely not end up being any kind of social housing scheme or idea to assign people to housing based on popularity or social credit scores or anything like that. Not at all. And yet, we must imagine that somehow there might be a better way of matching people to housing than the current system, which is based on who is in a social position to afford to buy houses and the land these houses sit on, a system that is great for some, but which also leaves so many others in society homeless or unhoused. From a broader perspective, we must admit that our current property ownership system is not so great either, at least not so great for everyone, just because of the way we treat residential land like an economic good, instead of what it really is, in fact, which is a social human-to-human right to use and occupy. So like I said last time, there might be 1,000 ways for different communities or nations to organize these rights to occupy under different sets of public law. So we must not imagine that there are no solutions to this human-to-human question, apart from either the highest bidder system or else some oppressive top-down assignment scheme. We must stretch ourselves to think beyond such false dualities. Okay, so now we received quite a few viewer questions in response to our last episode. So why don't we look at a couple of these questions for now. Linda?
Sure, absolutely. All right. Are there scenarios where compensation through money for harms or rights transfers could accidentally re-entangle rights as market goods? How would that be prevented?
Okay, this question is very pertinent to what we are currently discussing. Steiner said that it is vital to the social organism based on the division of labor that goods sometimes be exchanged for rights, just as long as the right, if it arises within the economic life, itself does not become a good. So the viewer's question is asking essentially, what scenarios could cause this to happen? That a right originates within the economic life and then becomes entangled with the life of goods. So maybe let's take an example. Imagine a product warranty. So for certain durable goods, such as a washing machine or something, the seller must somehow guarantee that it works properly. And the buyer must have a right that arises out of the economic life to have a properly functioning washing machine if they purchase one. But now let's say the seller decides to make this product warranty optional so that the buyer has to purchase this right for an additional fee. In other words, if there are two customers buying identical washing machines, only the one who purchases the warranty has the right to have it function properly. So someone who is less wealthy might end up with a broken machine and no recourse. In such a case, the independent rights state must step in from outside the economic life. It establishes consumer protection laws that mandate a baseline manufacturer's warranty for all durable products as part of the sticker price. The warranty right is legally fixed beforehand, and so it cannot be bought and sold like a good. This pulls the right out of the economic life, and the warranty is not treated like a good. An extended warranty, however, is not really a right at all because it extends beyond the framework of consumer protection granted by the rights state. Instead, an extended warranty is really a kind of insurance policy, a voluntary agreement, an economic parts and service contract concerning the future maintenance of a good. So an extended warranty belongs to the economic category and is not to be considered a right. So in general, by separating the rights life and the economic life within the threefold society, we ensure that rights remain rights and goods remain goods.
Wow. Thank you for that. That's a very clear example of how I didn't even think of that. So thank you, viewer, for the question. Second question. If employers are purchasing a worker's achievement rather than their labor time, what measurable unit replaces standard wages? And how does this work in less tangible service or knowledge sectors?
Okay, this is another really excellent question. So I thought we could take an example of, let's say, a psychotherapist. All right, the psychotherapist charges money representing a claim on goods for a therapy session. But what is really happening here? Is the therapist selling their time for money? In fact, no. The therapist is actually selling a right to access the therapist's skills and capacities for a specific limited period of time, let's say an hour. And this is the achievement, the application of their abilities during a 1 hour session. The labor that the therapist performs within that hour is not relevant. Only the fact that the client, through purchase, gains the right to access the therapist's full attention and skills for that hour. In this way, the hour really serves only as a container to measure the size of the achievement. So this exchange of rights for goods, for money representing a claim on goods, is a healthy relation in a society based on the division of labor. The right to access the therapist's professional capacity is considered a labor achievement, a kind of service package called a session, which has the character of an economic good. And then the client purchases this service achievement. Now, some threefolders might contend that Steiner was against using hours as a measuring stick for achievements. However, there's no textual basis for this opinion. What Steiner objected to, in fact, was that egoism enters into labor relations. We must avoid situations where the more hours I work, the more money I make. Because in such cases, I am no longer working for my fellow human being, and instead I'm working for myself, for the money I earn. Steiner's labor framework avoids paying people by the hour only in cases where this means purchasing the time and activity of another person, which is what he was actually opposed to. So in our example, if the therapist were paid by the hour, then they might be tempted, let's say, to slow down the progress of the session so that the client has to stay longer and thereby pay more to the therapist. But this is very different from booking a 1 hour appointment at a certain fee and then giving the client full attention during that hour, because in this case, the therapist is not being paid by the hour for their labor. They are being paid for a fixed 1 hour long achievement. And this principle applies elsewhere. A service provider might, say, operate a cash register for a shift of perhaps 8 hours. The task is what then becomes the contractual achievement. It's not bad to use hours as a measuring stick to measure the size of the achievement. Again, just as long as the worker is not being paid by the hour in such a way that promotes egoism, instead of providing us a particular service to our fellow human being. which is the whole point of economic fellowship. And we might also imagine providing a researcher in some knowledge industry a certain monthly stipend for their research work. This is not going to be an hours-based pay, such that the more they research, the more they earn. And yet, hours might be used as part of a contract to measure how much the researcher is expected, roughly, to contribute to that task on a weekly or monthly basis. Is that clear?
Yes, yes, absolutely. These are sort of, I guess, important details that, again, I think we haven't gotten to this place where we're going to be looking at it, but it's really important questions, curiosities that I'm so glad that are being brought up now. And we do have a lot of questions, a lot of viewer questions. So let's do a rapid fire segment where I'll ask the question, you answer, and then I'll go to the next and the next. Is that okay?
Sounds great. Let's do it.
All right. So, how would wage setting, social insurance, and employment law be structured under that separation?
Okay. Compensation would be included in the specific distribution contract, while the social insurance, the safety nets, and labor law fall under the larger rights framework of the state or government.
Okay. In cases where labor achievement is collective, for example, research teams, groups, factory shifts, how would compensation and rights be distributed to avoid focus on the market?
Okay, the labor laws of the right state specify the overall obligations of the individual to contribute, and the company is compelled by law to work within this given framework. At the same time, the company's specific distribution contract specifies the worker's entitlements to a share of the total product.
How would transactions that currently function as competitive markets, for example, buying, selling houses, be handled differently so transfers are treated as rights compensation?
Okay. Somehow, a layer of approval based on rights needs to be added. For farms and factories, this means that the new potential manager would be vetted for competence before being allowed to have the use rights over this kind of real estate. This is different from a pure market system where the highest bidder obtains this right independently of competence.
Okay. How would capital depreciation, long-term investment risk, and incentives to maintain or improve productive capital be managed if the right to use and right to transfer are split?
Okay, we already have this in the case of bank mortgages. One party has the right to use and benefit from use, including capital gains and losses. These are rights that the bank does not have. Meanwhile, the bank holds a lien which controls the right to transfer under certain conditions. So the new framework does not differ significantly from this, except really for the addition of the competency requirement for agricultural and commercial properties.
Okay, thank you. What kinds of institutions or legal changes would be required to separate the economic and rights areas without causing instability in current markets?
So without a doubt, there will be some disruption, of course, but this will be a very gradual transition that happens over decades, maybe centuries. So I describe how this might happen in my own book, Money for a Threefold Society, on the basis of a new institution that I call a financial community.
How could transitional steps be designed so current property owners and workers are not deprived?
So the transition from a price on the land component of real estate to a $0 valuation would occur through reimbursing the landowner. Funds for this would arise through the general public in a variety of ways.
How would the proposed model address large-scale speculative behavior, for example, land held vacant for price appreciation if the right to transfer is socially regulated.
So only the land component would have a $0 value. And so only the buildings and infrastructure would cost anything or require compensation at the point of transfer. Real estate speculation would end because the land component would never increase in value, while any buildings and infrastructure would depreciate over time and lose value.
Mhm. Okay, and that's all the questions right now.
Okay, that was a lot of questions.
Yes.
So, is there anything else, Linda, before we get started?
Nope, I'm good to go.
Okay. All right. So let's switch over to the screen share.
Mhm.
Okay. So we had left off last time we had only read one paragraph in our last
Yeah,
podcast,
yeah.
and we had a very long discussion about this. And I want to say that we have to expect this to happen more frequently in future, that because sometimes Steiner's writing can be very dense and require a lot of unpacking. So the last paragraph we read was this one, anyone who understands, right? And in that paragraph, Steiner describes the problem of exchanging goods or money that represents a claim on goods directly for rights. So it's not that we can never do this. It's sometimes entirely fine to compensate someone who has a right to compensation, by providing them with goods or money. We discussed the case of a liability that results from a car accident and a case of help that results from providing labor. It's entirely legitimate in these cases to give money representing goods as compensation for rights. It's even legitimate to compensate someone for the loss of rights when real estate use rights change hands. What we must avoid, however, is any notion that rights can be purchased. Just as we cannot purchase the liability that occurs in a car accident, neither can we purchase labor or real estate on a market as if these were economic goods. Yeah? So instead, in such cases, any money that passes from one party to another must strictly be understood as legal compensation. The related right is a matter of public law that must remain within the rights life and not get dragged down into the economic life where it is treated like a good. This requires the clear separation between the rights life and the economic life. So we spoke last time about how an economic relation must be modeled after a market transaction, like buying vegetables from a farmer. The customer buys only the vegetables, not the farmer's labor. There's an exchange of goods for money that the farmer can in turn use to buy whatever other goods they need or want, goods that sustain them into the future so they can produce more vegetables again. This exchange of goods for goods is the economic track. And on an entirely separate rights track, certain laws and regulations govern this economic exchange of goods. By purchasing the vegetables, the customer is legally required to compensate the farmer at the agreed upon price. The vegetables cannot be stolen, for example, because that is against the law of the right state. So separately, there's a whole body of legal rights that governs economic transactions from the outside. So the imagination of the farmer's market also guides us in the understanding of the relation between employer and employee. Here, however, we have a closed system where there's no open economic market like a farmer's market. Nevertheless, in a way quite similar to the open market, if a farmer hires a farmhand, for instance, they do not purchase the farmhand's labor. Instead, the farmer literally purchases the achievement of that labor, namely the milk drawn from the cow, according to Steiner's own words in Lecture 7 of his National Economics course. But to add even more precision to what was said last time, in this case, the farmer doesn't even buy the milk as an isolated economic good, because the employer-employee relation does not occur within the context of an open market. Instead, the farmhand operates as a co-worker within the larger farm enterprise. The milk is considered part of the collective achievement of the farm, and the farmhand receives a predetermined share of the total economic yield of the farm based strictly on a rights contract, which Steiner calls a distribution contract in his collected works number 330. So this contract arises on a completely separate legal track where the human-to-human relation between employer and employee is governed by the life of human-to-human rights. The contract governs the respective obligations and entitlements of each party, including what the worker is obliged to contribute and what share of the farm's total production they are entitled to. This rights relation must be something entirely separate from the economic relation. And this is essentially Steiner's idea for a new labor framework, which, as we said last time, has already come about to a limited degree during the course of the 20th century as a result of changes to labor laws and labor relations following the global labor movements of the 1930s, which was after Steiner's lifetime. However, the full labor framework Steiner imagined has still not been completed, and indeed cannot be fully completed until state and economy are truly made separate. Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
that's where we're at.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything you want to talk about or bring up?
Well, it just kind of reminds me of, like, say, if this is more of a family and a more respectful kind of, I mean, if you're contributing as the farmer's hand to, draw some milk from the cow, everybody who has worked on that farm, including the farmer, has contributed in order for that farmer's hand to bring about some milk. And so, it really is feels like a more respectful and more like family oriented, community oriented, and honorable kind of way of transacting. um that's what I'm hearing right now. So, you know
This is
just one.
exactly the point, Linda. You're right
Mhm,
on. You're exactly right. The milk is not made in isolation. Someone had to feed the cows. Someone had to clean the barn. Someone had to grow the hay or whatever they're eating, the feed.
mhm,
These could all be different people. So
mhm,
when one person draws milk from the cow, they're not doing this in isolation, as if the
mhm,
milk magically appeared, right? It's a collaboration that when any kind of working environment, whether it's a factory or anything, is a collaboration of many people. And so there's just these two elements. The one is the relationship between the people, including the supervisors, the managers, and the organizers of the labor, and the people who do the actual work. That is a human to human rights question. What is the contribution? What are people obliged to contribute versus what part of the share do they receive? This is a contract.
mhm,
Then you have a separate track where the total system outputs some kind of good. Then the good is sold on the market, let's say for money, and then the money comes back, and then that's the distribution contract. How does this get divided up? That is
mhm,
the economic track.
mhm,
And because we separate them, it's exactly as you say, it becomes a more respectable relation between people that isn't so hierarchical. It allows for human freedom,
mhm, mhm.
right?
And I think that, it kind of really has this feeling or this sense that, this is how a family would treat a conscientious family would treat their children. For instance, they would say, well, you milk the cow and you'll get your fair share, and here's the contribution that you have added. I think it feels better,
Yeah.
less ego, less hierarchical.
Yeah.
And I mean, yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned ego just now. It is a non-egoistic relation because everyone is producing not for their own benefit. but for the benefit of their fellow human being. This is the economic fellowship principle. And I want to add that it's not just that the employees can do whatever they want. That they're still under some contract to supply labor in accordance with the organizer of that labor. Steiner really speaks about the management as having initiative and having the right of to say, I want you to do this work today and I want you to do that work today. And it's not really up to the workers to decide, have their own job assignments. It's not a free for all, right? The it's important that the managers also, who are part of the cultural life, have a free hand in organizing the labor. And in exchange, the workers receive a certain share of the total product,
Mhm.
independently of what they actually achieve.
Mhm.
Okay.
Cool. Yes, thank you.
So we'll talk about this more, but
Mhm.
that's just to get us going.
Mhm.
All right, so let's continue. The next paragraph begins at the bottom of page 57, and it's another one of these long paragraphs. Let's just do the first chunk. It starts in the standard of living, and then do you see about maybe 8 lines down at the top of page 58, it says the economic organization will allow.
Yes.
So we'll read not that, but up to that part,
Mhm.
first of all, okay? So
Mhm.
in this first chunk, he's going to say that if we consider the standard of living of an individual person, what does an individual need to live decently?
Mhm.
What is to be considered a reasonable standard of living, and who should decide this?
Mhm.
On one hand, this is a matter of rights to be decided by some democratic body. On the other hand, it's also a matter of economics, because a society cannot provide people with a standard of living above what the economy itself can sustain. So the standard of living arises from two directions, from the rights and from economics. The economic life makes a judgment from the perspective of expertise by those with the necessary training and experience. And the rights life makes a determination based on democratic rights consciousness, law, and administration. Okay, so if you could read
Mhm.
that, please.
Sure. In the standard of living of an individual person, the effects of the rights institutions flow together with the effects of purely economic activity. In a healthy social organism, these effects must come from two different directions. Within the economic organization, education in a particular branch of industry and familiarity gained through experience in this branch are to provide the leading personalities with the necessary perspectives. Within the rights organization, what is demanded out of rights consciousness as the relationship of individual people or groups of people to one another is realized through the law and administration.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right. So I think it's clear. He's saying when we talk about a standard of living or a guaranteed right to a standard of living, this is a decision that is made by the rights organization. But it can't make this decision in isolation. It has to consult or look at the economic circumstances.
Mhm.
Right? So,
Yeah.
so I'll just maybe give an example. If you have in a very tropical place, for instance, you might have it might be very easy to have food available to sustain people that you could theoretically only work a day or two a week, and everyone could provide enough sustenance. So in that case, they would say the standard of living is such and the economics is there to produce a certain standard of living for everyone, and they can have a lot of leisure time. But in another situation, maybe in a more temperate area where there's, wheat farming we talked about, that takes maybe 300 times as much labor, then you can't have as much leisure time just as a matter of economic fact, right? So the rights organization will have to come up with a different amount of labor that's required by everyone, and they will have a different standard of living. So the democratic rights consciousness determines the standard of living of people subject to the economic circumstances.
Hmm. Okay.
Okay?
I mean, yeah, yeah. I can
All
see
right.
how some people would want to move to the tropics.
Yep. All right. So the second chunk in this part, he's talking about he's going to change topic slightly, and he's going to speak about how within the economy, people might join together to form mutually interacting blocks, such as workers' cooperatives or consumer cooperatives, or possibly other groups based on common interests, like corporations. However, the economy itself will be based on something different, on economic associations, which are not to be understood as any kind of self-interested group. Instead, associations are to be based on purely economic activity, working within the legal and regulatory framework that is given from outside from the rights life. So if, on the one hand, these economic associations are able to assert the economic interests of the people they represent, they will not have any need to encroach upon the rights life, that is, on the regulations established democratically by the same people who also produce and consume. So the associations will render unnecessary the roles of labor unions, business alliances, and social democracy. And if, on the other hand, the right state stays out of economic and business affairs, then government will only create institutions that align with the rights consciousness of citizens. Even if the same people sit as representatives in economic associations and also in democratic parliaments, the separation of economy and rights state ensures that one social member will not unduly influence the other area in an unhealthy way, as can happen at present because economy and state remain unified. Okay, so let's read that and then we'll discuss.
Okay. The economic organization will allow people with the same vocational or consumer interests or with the same needs in other respects to join together to form cooperatives, which will give rise to the overall economy through mutual interaction. The economic organization will be built upon an associative basis and on the relation of associations. These associations will manifest a purely economic activity. The legal foundation upon which they work comes to them from the rights organization. If such economic associations can assert their economic interests in the representative and administrative bodies of the economic organization, then they will not develop the urge to encroach upon the legislative or administrative leadership of the legal state. For example, as a union of farmers, a party of industrialists as economically oriented social democracy in order to pursue what they cannot achieve within the economic life. And if the legal state does not participate in any branch of industry at all, then it will create only institutions that derive from the rights consciousness of the people who belong to it. Even if the same people who are active within the economic life sit as representatives of the legal state, as is self-evident, the subdivision into economic and rights life cannot lead to an influence of the economic life upon the rights life that undermines the health of the social organism in the way it can be undermined if a state organization itself manages branches of industry and if representatives of the economic life pass laws out of economic interests.
Okay, so the big picture that he's painting here is the separation that we're talking about of social threefolding is not a separation of people, it's a separation of social areas. So it's actually the same people doing different tasks. So at one moment, the people are involved in a democratic rights process. And then at another moment, the same people are involved in the economic process. So they come together as associations of producers, distributors, and consumers, or representatives of these. And so they participate in the economic life. They're kind of wearing different hats at different times. And the unity of society will come through this human being who is playing these different roles, even though the society itself is separated into these different areas. So we're not talking about separating people, that over here we have the economic people and over there we have the rights people. No, right? The rights decisions are made by the producers and consumers because they are people who produce and consume. And the economic decisions are made by people that are part of the democratic rights life. So the people connect them, but the areas themselves are entirely separate.
Mhm.
That makes sense?
Yeah. So just to give can you give a sort of an example of that?
Sure.
I'm just because I don't want to misunderstand this.
Okay.
Like I'm sort of, yeah.
Yeah. So an example would be just like, Linda is part of a democratic process. You have a right to vote. You may participate in politics. You may have a party affiliation. Who knows? And so you are, as a human being, you are part of the rights life, the rights state political life. Okay. Now, let's say you're also called upon to be a representative of some industry. Let's say, as a psychotherapist, you might be called upon to represent all the psychotherapists in your area and to speak for even the service industry of your area in an economic association. Okay.
Mhm.
So you will have a different hat to wear when you're sitting in the economic association meeting as a representative of service producers, let's say, but you are not a different person. You still have, your party affiliation. You still have your thoughts about politics and rights life. It's part of who you are, but you are not expressing that in the context of the producer discussion, which is strictly limited to talking about, should the price of psychotherapy be higher or lower or things like that.
Mhm.
These are non-political discussions there.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, in another context, you go to the voting booth. This is not really an economic process. You're not really talking about prices. You're not talking about distribution or production. Once you're in the voting booth, you have the opportunity to express your equal opinion about what party should be in control and so on. These things will play into each other, right? So your viewpoints, it's not that you will make an economic decision out of politics or make a political decision out of economics. The areas themselves are separate,
Mhm.
but the
And
humans combine it. Yeah.
yeah, and just to make sure you're not any way, shape, or form saying that the people that will be in charge of the economics are going to be the same people that are in charge of the democratic rights process. I mean, it could like because the expertise in the economic world, I mean that's a separate association. Could say X person be such an expert in the economic world, and then and that same person go into the rights world and say, hey, now could they have that kind of interchangeability or no?
So this is and actually what Steiner is going to speak about in the next paragraph. So can you
Oh,
just hold
okay.
that for a moment? Because this is a key, like it's a very good question. It's a very essential question. The picture I want to bring forward in this paragraph is he's talking about the separation that it's like we have it's like the area of social life calls us to have a different behavior or a different framework for thinking about different this area, which is a different framework from thinking about that area at a different time, even though it may be the same people.
Okay.
Yeah. And
Hmm.
in the next paragraph, he'll go into what you're talking about. So just hang on. I,
Okay.
I want to say a few more things about this part of the paragraph. Um, because there's a footnote here in number 23, and this is a translator footnote that I added to the translation. And I'll just read it. It's on pages 71 and 72 of the book. A
Okay.
few months after the original publication of this book, on the 28th of April, 1919, in a lecture given in Zurich on the 25th of October, 1919, which is in the Social Future, Lecture 2, which is Collected Works 332A, Steiner distinguished the cooperative principle from the associative principle. So in this lecture, cooperatives, in German Genossenschaften, which he regarded as a kind of tyranny, arose when consumers or workers with common interests banded together to form a more powerful negotiating bloc. By contrast, the associations, in German Assoziationen, arose when existing competent producers collaborated to meet demand in quantities and at prices that allowed everyone to get their needs met. So to say the economic life will allow groups to form based on self-interest, like cooperatives or corporations. But the overall administration of the economy will be done by associations. The associations ensure that production or supply is managed appropriately in relation to demand, in relation to need, so that healthy prices arise. A healthy price, as Steiner will go on to discuss later in chapter 3, is one that is neither too high nor too low. If a price is too low, the producer will not receive enough to get their needs met. And if a price is too high, the consumer will pay too much, and so they won't have enough left over to get their needs met. A healthy price is arrived at by managing supply, by increasing production to bring the price down, or decreasing production to bring the price up, until the free market price corresponds to the value given to a good by human needs. This is what he says in this Social Future Lecture 2. So an economic association will bring reason into the otherwise chaotic free market system. So there's neither oversupply nor undersupply relative to demand. And as a result of this supply management, prices on the free market will become healthy. And this can only happen if the economic associations are themselves not based on self-interest, like cooperatives or corporations might be. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yes. Sounds really ideal because, I mean, we're all suffering because of the production or non-production of oil, say, right now. So we have an understanding of what that really feels like on the consumer's pockets, and to be able to supply enough so there's not waste, perhaps, or it seems that there's chaos right now in the marketplace,
Yep,
and that
exactly.
will, yeah.
The We have the case of oil industry right now is basically operated through a cartel system where the
Mhm,
producers dictate the supply and therefore the price, and they can alter the supply and adjust the price. This is exactly the reality of market economics. And what
mhm,
Steiner is saying is that instead of having a producer only group tyrannizing the consumer, like a cartel or a cooperative or a corporation. Instead, you need to have an association where producers, distributors, and consumers sit down and together decide what is the right price. Because if the price of, say, oil is too high, that's great for the producer, but lousy for the consumer.
mhm,
And if it's too low, it's vice versa. So, how can production supply levels be set so that the price is healthy for everyone?
mhm,
Because ultimately, the consumers and the producers in the general case are the same people. The
mhm,
workers are consumers,
Mhm.
right? So we want to find a way where everything in society, all the prices, whether it's oil or bananas or eggs, all these prices, or even psychotherapy sessions, they all come into some relation where everything that is needed is affordable.
Mhm. Mhm.
And the producers get enough and the consumers get enough
Mhm.
because ultimately they're the same people, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So the association's job is to kind of bring this big picture to the story and to bring reason into the marketplace.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's not to take over the marketplace. They're not a command economy where they say, okay, you have to produce this much or that much. It's more like just a realization through seeing everybody's aspect together. The representatives of each of these groups come together and they say, well, this price is hurting us. It's hurting the whole supply chain. It's hurting the consumer and driving them into poverty. So we need to find a way to either bring the price down or switch to some other means of energy production.
Mhm. Sounds cool.
Yeah. And it's not really idealism in the sense of, pie in the sky. I
No,
think this actually does happen in real life and it could happen more.
right. I mean, you have brought up the eggs in Canada before, where you talk about this kind of thing happening where we can produce, the farmers can produce a certain amount of eggs to supply for the consumers. So, yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
in Canada, we have the supply management system. I'm
Hmm.
not saying that it's ideal. It
Hmm.
it actually comes out of more of a socialist framework, but the notion is that there are kind of production licenses or quotas. So you have to have a dairy production or certain kind of license in order to sell eggs, dairy on the open market in Canada, right? So this is a way to find this right balance of supply. So there's neither an oversupply nor an undersupply, and that we find that the price is just right.
Hmm.
But it does allow those who do produce to be better off, to have enough. The producers earn enough because they're not dumping extra production
Hmm.
like they do in some places,
Got
right? So this is very wasteful, and
it.
and I think this is a step in the right direction. I think this Canadian supply management system is flawed because the licenses are you have to buy them now, and so they become an economic right, and this is a problem that we just discussed.
Hmm.
You shouldn't have to buy the right to sell eggs. You should have the right assigned through a system that is fair. And right
Hmm.
now it's managed by the provinces and it's highly unfair.
Interesting. I didn't know that. Okay. Thank
Yeah,
you.
little farmers almost cannot afford like a dairy license. It's 10 times the cost of a cow to get the license to sell the
Wow.
milk of a cow. It's very out of hand,
Hmm. Not good.
right?
Okay.
And it's an example where the rights should not be an economic good that you
Hmm.
purchase. This
Hmm.
is this is the problem. Yeah.
Good
Anyway,
example. Hmm.
okay. So let's just do one more paragraph maybe,
Yeah.
because it addresses what you just said, or you were asking about
Hmm.
what happens when this gets confused or whatever. So
Hmm.
Steiner gives an example. He says he's going to talk about Austria. So
Hmm.
Austria, when in 1919, okay, so this was after the war, and so a little bit of history. There was prior to the war the Austro-Hungarian Empire,
Hmm.
and he's talking a little bit about the history of that and how it demonstrates what arises when the economy and rights state are fused. So, in the constitution that was adopted by the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1867, which is what established the dual monarchy, the members of the lower house of the Imperial Council were chosen indirectly through these provincial diets, they were called, according to four socioeconomic classes called curia. Okay. So the four classes were the community of large landowners class, the chambers of commerce and industry, the cities, markets, and industrial towns, and the rural communities. So each of these could select essentially the people that would run the government. And then this curia system was subsequently formalized and made a direct form of election in 1873. The system ensured that the aristocracy and the wealthy had disproportionate power over political affairs. And so the Constitution was designed so that the economic power relations were fused with the rights state. Now, even though the system was later replaced by universal male suffrage in 1907, the damage had already been done. Tremendous divisiveness had already resulted from requiring all the different nationalities under this banner. That was the Austrians, the Hungarians, the Bohemians, the Moravians, the Silesians, the Slovaks, the Slovenes, the Slavonians, the Croatians, the Bosnians, the Serbs, and many more. All of these people had to coexist under the rule of the economic powers. And this divisiveness contributed to the tensions that eventually led to the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand by a Bosnian Serb rebel. And this event, in turn, set off the chain of events that ignited the flames of World War I and led to the eventual disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Steiner is asking the question, what might have been different had a separate rights life unfolded alongside and parallel to the economic life? Would a peaceful coexistence of such diverse peoples have perhaps been possible? Okay, so if you could read that, please.
Sure. Austria offered a typical example of the fusion of economic life with the rights life, with a constitution it adopted in the 1860s. The representatives of the Imperial Council of this region were elected from the four branches of economic life, from the community of large landowners, the chambers of commerce, the cities, markets, and industrial towns, and the rural communities. We see how nothing was principally thought of for this composition of state representation except that the rights life would arise from the assertion of economic relations. It is certain that in the current disintegration of Austria, the divisive forces of its nationalities have played a significant role. But it can be regarded as equally certain that a rights organization, which could have unfolded its activity alongside the economic one, would have developed out of rights consciousness, a shaping of the social organism in which a coexistence of peoples would have been possible.
Okay, so this speaks directly to what you said earlier, Linda, about what would happen like if the economic people were also in charge of the government.
Mhm, mhm,
The same people that were powerful in the economic life were also powerful in the democratic rights life, or in
mhm,
this case, it wasn't really democratic. And I think the answer is clear. It would create divisiveness.
mhm.
And
Yeah.
so Steiner's representing a threefold social organism where there's a separation of economics rights and the cultural life, which means the national language, the all these cultural differences between all these different groups. They might have had their own school system, their own legal or court systems, judges of speaking their own languages and so on. And he thinks this would have created a different environment that would not have led to the violence between the nations that eventually ignited World War I and spread to be a world war.
Mhm, mhm,
So it's a kind of peace concept. He's saying the only way to get along really is to have the separation into these three areas.
mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah. And I think that, just generally speaking, naturally as human beings, we tend to have that acknowledgement that, I mean, with all um, this example of Austria and, all of the different cultures, if they felt like they had a voice, if they felt like they had their rights and their values respected.
So Steiner is painting a picture of a different way of doing things. Instead of a single hierarchical unified society where the economy and the rights are blended and the culture is forced to come along with whatever these powers have in mind, he has this notion of a separation of the three areas so that there's an entirely separate economic group. In this case, these four branches that he names. You can imagine those people operating their economic life in a very good way that is completely separate from a democratic rights life that later they implemented based on the equal right to vote. And this would occur separately from the economic life. And then a third separate area of language, culture, the differences that could take place completely independently of politics and economics.
Mhm,
And this decentralized concept is what will invariably lead to peace and the end of the divisiveness that we see. We spoke about how because there's only one pie, everyone is fighting over that one pie. If we could
mhm,
divide the pie up into different parts, then each could have their own part and be satisfied with that.
mhm. Right. Yeah, I see that.
And this is the
Um,
idea of social threefolding.
Interesting. Okay, very good.
All right, so that's all the time we have for today, and we will see you next time.
Yes, see you next time.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit like and subscribe.